unlike many of my viewers, I am old enough to remember the year 1989. And I'm old enough to have witnessed the disintegration and reintegration of communist ideology in the years after 1989. After 1989, many different political tendencies and schools of thought took the bits and pieces of what had been communism, what had been previously openly called Marxism and socialism, and tried to reformulate them under various headings. I think the only heading that's really lasted has been anti-capitalism. And I really do regard anti-capitalism as the stupidest, the least worthy of rebuttal, the most worthless of the ersatz ideologies of our era, and as a political program that has nothing positive to offer in Canada. It has nothing positive to offer in Taiwan. I mean, I've lived in and I've examined and researched so many diverse countries and settings. And anti-capitalism, sadly, has emerged from the rubble of communism as this sort of very peculiar, worst of all worlds mixed bag of, ideological bits and pieces. Many of you, if you watch this and you identify as anti-capitalist, will feel that the critique I'm about to offer doesn't apply to you. And that in itself is part of the problem here. If you have an entirely nebulous and negatively defined political movement, then it is very easy for people to shirk responsibility, for people to evade any form of debate, discussion, or accountability by simply saying, oh, well, that doesn't apply to me. Whereas communism or Marxism had a clear definition, had foundational texts, you could very clearly delineate who was and wasn't a real communist, or of course there are various specific categories within communism that people either did or did not adhere to, and so on. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to address two categories of anti-capitalists. On the one hand, there are the anti-capitalists who have retained their adherence to the concept of class war. It would be fair to say that the most important leitmotif of Marxism that continued through all forms of communism was the idea of class war or class warfare. There's a famous phrase, no war but the class war. The reality of what class war is, you can read it in a purely theoretical sense, you can read it in Marx, you can read it in Lenin, you can read it in Stalin, you can read it in Mao Zedong. I think it's crucially important for people to take the time to read the horrifying accounts of door-to-door, house-to-house violence, of robbery, of rape, of torture, of murder, of what class warfare really meant in practice, in any one example, whether that's in Russia in 1917 or it's in Cambodia in the 1970s. Class war, simply put, is not class re-education. It's not class Socratic debate. It's not class democracy. It's not class mutual representation in the House of Parliament. Class war is a violent struggle of one group of people to snuff out, silence, murder another. And history has shown that again and again in the history of communism. There are anti-capitalists, and I have seen them and met them and heard them speak, I mean, face to face. I'm not just talking about YouTube or, in published form. There are anti-capitalists who still support class war, and those anti-capitalists have basically held on to the most violent, most destructive, most immoral aspects of communism, while oddly giving up the structured system-building elements that, both provide a rationale for that violence, provide a sort of philosophical series of excuses for it, and also provide other elements that might be of some use to somebody somewhere, elements related to, organizing labor, dissent, and this kind of thing. So that really is a sort of remarkable worst of all worlds form of anti-capitalism. And many of you watching this video, just given who my viewers are, will say that they are anti-capitalist, but they don't believe in anything like that. They don't believe in class war. They don't believe that, as Marx set down and so many communists believed ever after, that the laws of history require a violent struggle between social classes to achieve progress of any kind. Okay, so that's the second category of anti-capitalists, are the anti-capitalists who identify with this concept, but who do not endorse violence, and who have definitely distanced themselves in a more meaningful sense to a greater extent from the legacy of communism. When I speak to people in the second category, face-to-face, to make anti-capitalism less nebulous, I often talk to them about what the definition of capitalism really is, because they very often are interested in knowing why I am not an anti-capitalist. Anti-capitalism, unlike communism, does not have a clear and coherent contrast to offer to capitalism. Obviously, communists were not just anti-capitalist, they were pro-communist, and they could point to one of several real systems of social organization in which banking did not operate, in which private property did not exist, in which various forms of heavy-handed state control of enterprise replaced the role of private sector investors, and so on. So they could say, okay, this is capitalism, and this is anti-capitalism. It's needless to say that those experiments were by and large disasters. Almost none of those people would choose to live in the Soviet Union under Stalin or even in East Germany, etc., etc. Nevertheless, let's not digress. They did have a contrast to pose. And the vast majority of anti-capitalists in the current era, and in the second category of basically being nonviolent, they're often unable to articulate what it is in the definition of capitalism they object to. And of course, they do not want to rely on, for example, a contrast between capitalism and feudalism. The reality is that capitalism in Europe is the system that emerged from the disintegration of the system we had in the Dark Ages, a system of feudal control of land and property and wealth and production. During the era of feudalism, we actually did have factories. We did have some remarkably advanced technology. There were very inspiring and well-illustrated books about, how the world worked. And again, it's impressive in some ways in the Roman Empire. It's impressive in ancient China. And yes, actually, in the Middle Ages in Europe, you can look at remarkable examples of how, without electricity, people did organize large-scale industries, large-scale factories, glass factories, for example. But, creation of textiles, under many headings in many ways, human organization was complex. But in Europe, in Western Europe specifically, there was a system that banned the buying and selling of land. There was a system that tied the ownership of land to people's names, to people's hereditary rights. And for the most part, not for everyone in society, but for huge numbers of people, tied their job, where they were allowed to live, what kind of work they were allowed to do, to the land, to serfdom of various kinds. Capitalism, simply put, is what emerged from the disintegration of that system. And as you may be aware, it disintegrated in places like Holland, the Netherlands, more rapidly than it disintegrated in places like Russia. In Russia, the abolition of serfdom was embarrassingly late. And it was for that reason that in the Netherlands you had the first emergence of the corporation as a real entity, a corporation that had voting rights for investors. And this again was part of the progress towards modern democracy, not democracy as we knew in ancient Athens. Shareholder democracy, as it's called, voting within corporations, actually came about before modern democracy in a meaningful sense. It is not worth my digressing into the history of that. Many people in England especially really misunderstand just how late and how recent the features of modern democracy were in their parliamentary system. I'm tempted to say more about that. But anyway, the function of the parliament itself changed tremendously at a later date than most people want to admit. Even though the name of the parliament existed, there was a time when it did not at all serve the public function that we now associate with it. In any case, this peculiar progress towards a concept of semi-democratic government, capitalist democracy is certainly badly flawed in many ways, and of accountability of companies to their shareholders, and of the buying and selling of land as something that anyone can own, not tied to your name, to your birthright, not tied to favors granted to you by a king because your ancestors fought in a war, and not for any other reason. Capitalism, in some ways it's easy to define if you work against a checklist. Can you buy and sell land? Is there a private and independent operation of banks? are businesses started up by private individuals who get a bank loan, et cetera, et cetera. You can put together this checklist, and it's very useful to contrast that to how communism operated or to how feudalism operated. And in some countries around the world still today, there are aspects of feudalism that still exist. There are some countries where indigenous peoples still own land through a king or a chiefdom and then grant the right to farm that land in a feudal manner. So feudalism here and there around the world is still a significant way of organizing land, organizing people, and organizing an economy. In some places, sadly, of course, slavery still exists too. But when I invite people to express to me precisely what it is that they dislike about capitalism, I very often find that the people who define themselves as anti-capitalist are not, in fact, anti-capitalist at all. They're simply people who lack an education in Economics 101. And I do realize that some of you watching this video will be deeply offended by that. However, if it makes you feel any better, believe me, the vast majority of people I met who were diehard communists utterly lacked an education in Economics 101. For them, if anything, they found a certain mystique to any kind of economic claim, and the magical thinking surrounding economics and communism was often something that drew them in, something that made them feel powerful, made them feel that they understood truly how the world's economy worked, while others did not. Now, one of the peculiar ironies within anti-capitalism today is that the driving sentiment is often a sense of horror at the exploitation of workers in factories, for example, the exploitation of child labor. And they're unaware that Karl Marx was pro-child labor. Read Volume 1 of Das Kapital if you don't believe me. And that Karl Marx was incredibly optimistic about factory labor itself. And this is a contrast to the bizarre guilt over factory labor of any kind, over exploitation of labor of any kind, that tends to be the sort of bottommost sentiment animating people who consider themselves anti-capitalist. They feel guilt about the fact that the products they buy are made in factories in conditions that they imagine are terrible, and in some cases, not all, this is true. I mean, in some cases, the clothes you wear may be made by prisoners. This wasn't. I've met the tailor face to face. I know exactly who made this. I've seen the room he works in. I've met his wife. I know what conditions he lives in. So believe me, not all clothing is made by slave labor. Not everyone's working in a sweatshop. Anyway, nice guy too. So, it's possible to know exactly where your clothes come from or where your shoes come from. And it's not all bad news. My point here is not just to draw attention to the contrast between the tremendous optimism Karl Marx had that all of society would be regenerated by factory labor. He optimistically says in Das Kapital, Marx believed that child labor would empower children to become independent from their parents, and this would be part of the breakdown of the oppressive and feudal nature of the nuclear family. That this new era of factory labor was going to liberate everyone because kids would have their own income at an early age, so their parents couldn't push them around so much anymore. He was recklessly optimistic about factory labor in contrast to the conditions of peasants. He thought this was the end of an era of peasants toiling in ignorance and being dependent on the state. And this was instead an era of independent factory workers and the withering away of the state. So there was all kinds of bizarre idealism Karl Marx had that's incompatible with the baseline assumptions of the sort of white guilt-based anti-capitalism that I see being somewhat popular today. It's only a moderately popular ideology. Many months ago, maybe a couple of years ago on this channel, I did talk about this under some headings. If you are sincerely concerned about factory conditions, do research. Visit factories. Learn real facts. Move beyond ambiguous and nebulous moral claims to understand how the factories really work. Because I tell you something, in Cambodia, where I did actually do research on factory conditions, but in Cambodia as an example, you can visit one factory where conditions are wonderful and where people are living really good lives and earning good money, etc., etc. And you can visit another factory where the conditions are much worse and the workers are unhappier and the pay is too low and so on. And the difference between those two factories is not the difference between capitalism and anti-capitalism. It's not the difference between libertarianism and socialism. It's not the difference between conservative and liberal. The difference between a good workplace and a bad workplace does not lend itself to any of the polarizing ideologies of our era. But so many polarizing ideologies have tried to fasten onto these things, have tried to take a hold of the concept of exploitation itself and to cynically make it into a justification for their personal struggle, their party struggle to take over power, to take over government, to take over the state. And the reality is that exploitation and ameliorating or ending exploitation, improving exploitative practices, whether it's in farming or in factories or in the coffee shop down the street, is not linked to any one ideology. You can go to a wonderful factory that's run by a conservative Catholic. You can go to a wonderful factory that's run by a left-wing person. You can go to a wonderful factory that's run by some right-wing libertarian person, but who really cares about his workers having good conditions. And you can learn all their bizarre management philosophies or what kind of education they had or how they came to run their particular factory in the way that they did. And you can look at the material conditions and the political conditions and why it is that sometimes you have two factories that are across the street from each other and the conditions are so very different. So in a sense, the alternative to, from my perspective, the alternative to anti-capitalism as an ideology is anti-ideology. The alternative is to really care, to have sincere humanitarian engagement, whether it's with the reality of the factories that make your clothes, or the factories that make toys, the factories that make iPhones, whatever it is. You can do the work. These things are knowable, and you can't know everything. But at some stage in that process of having an informed opinion about how the stuff we buy is made, you're going to realize that there is no simple ideological fissure between right and wrong, good and evil. And it's simply not the case that socialists or communists or left-wingers or anti-capitalists have a magic bullet solution that would improve factory conditions for everyone. On the contrary, all of us are left with a tremendously complex world, a tremendously nuanced world of government regulation, of labor activism, of various free market forces, and of, the other reality being that at any given time there are millions and millions of people who do live dignified lives, who do earn a good, honest living, whether it's working in factories or making this jacket in a tailor shop down the road. It isn't the case that there's a simple class of the oppressed to be contrast to a class of the oppressors. Instead, the world is full of gray areas of conflicting and complex information between good working conditions, bad working conditions, mediocre working conditions, and a directionless struggle of human beings trying to live lives of dignity, and of different political forces trying to improve the lot of different classes of workers at any given time, that in no sense conforms to Karl Marx's simplified view of class war. It neither justifies class war nor is justified by it.